Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers in Lagos. Rescue teams in southern Turkey say they can still hear voices from under the rubble more than a week after a devastating 7.8 magnitude quake offered in a glimmer of hope of finding more survivors. Live images show rescuers working in two areas of the Kahramanmaraş region where they were trying to save three sisters believed to be buried under the debris. In the same region, emergency workers saved a 35-year-old woman who was believed to have been buried for more than 205 hours. Two brothers, 17-year-old Mohammed Yanina and his 21-year-old sibling Abdul Baki, were also pulled from collapsed buildings further east. In the city of Adıyaman, rescuers pulled out an 18-year-old boy and a man from the rubble, while Ukraine's rescue team pulled a woman from the rubble further south. More than a week after the tremor and its violent aftershocks, more than 41,000 people have been confirmed dead in Turkey and Syria, and survival stories are becoming few and far between. Meanwhile, a 77-year-old woman has been rescued after 212 hours under the rubble. Similarly, a 42-year-old woman was rescued from the rubble of a building in the southern Turkish city of Kahramanmaraş almost 222 hours after the disaster occurred. Video footage released by local rescue services show rescue workers carrying the woman to an ambulance. The disaster has left many survivors homeless in near-freezing winter temperatures. Meanwhile, Britain's King Charles has met with volunteers in London collecting aid to be sent to earthquake-hit Turkey and Syria. King Charles spoke with the volunteers who were gathering items to send, including sleeping bags and clothing items. In Trafalgar Square, the British monarch spoke with a member of the White Helmets, a humanitarian organization who has been involved in trying to save people from the rubble of destroyed buildings. And in the aftermath of the disaster, the World Health Organization is warning of the risk of waterborne diseases and outbreaks in Turkey and Syria. The agency's regional director for Europe, Hans Kluge, says 26 million people in both Turkey and Syria need humanitarian assistance, and 1 million people in Turkey have lost their homes.
Just over a week since this terrible tragedy, there are also growing concerns over emerging health issues linked to the cold weather, hygiene and sanitation, and the spread of infectious diseases, with vulnerable people especially at risk. We stand beside the Minister of Health, Dr. Fahrettin Koca, and the Turkish Ministry of Health, who report that critical vaccine supplies, including against tetanus and rabies, have been sent to the quake zone, and mobile pharmacies have begun operating.
Severe damage to water and sanitation system. It's a great concern, and it increases the risk of waterborne diseases and outbreaks of communicable diseases. We at the country level work jointly under the UN country team mechanism, because this disaster requires comprehensive response, including water provision, protection, sanitation, food and shelter. So we coordinate with various line ministries through the UN mechanism. It's also beyond Ministry of Health.
In the meantime, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has announced a $397 million humanitarian appeal for the people of the earthquake-ravaged Syria to cover a period of 3 months, with a similar appeal for Turkey in the final stages. Speaking to journalists in New York, Mr. Guterres notes that in the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, the United Nations rapidly provided $50 million through the Central Emergency Response Fund, but now the needs are immense. He says the appeal brings together the entire UN system and humanitarian partners.
Today, I'm announcing that the United Nations is launching a $397 million humanitarian appeal for the people of earthquake-ravaged Syria, and this will cover a period of 3 months. We are in the final stages of a similar appeal for Turkey. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, the United Nations rapidly provided $50 million through the Central Emergency Response Fund. But the needs are immense. The Syria effort brings together the entire UN system and humanitarian partners and will help secure desperately needed life-saving relief for nearly 5 million Syrians, including shelter, healthcare, food, and protection. We all know that life-saving aid has not been getting in at the speed and scale needed. The scale of this disaster is one of the worst in recent memory. 1 week after the devastating earthquakes, millions of people across the region are struggling for survival, homeless, and in freezing temperatures. We are doing all we can to change this, but much more is needed.
Let's bring in geopolitical affairs analyst Shahzada Rahim, who joins us virtually from Ankara in Turkey. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, so it's more than a week after the devastating earthquake. What's the situation like on ground?
Yeah, like it's the 10th day since the powerful earthquake hit the southern Turkey and northwest Syria. The situation is very dire here. The people are complaining about the lack and shortages of food and all facilities. And the temperature is already freezing here. The temperatures are below zero in most of the provinces which were hit by the recent earthquake on Monday. So the people are complaining, and they're complaining against the government, and they're saying the government is not doing enough. But we have to understand the situation, like in detail. Like this earthquake has affected more than 10 provinces. Like they're the larger cities, mega cities, like where a lot of people, like more than like 13 million people are affected only in Turkey. So it's a very dire situation for the government to handle at all. Like, so Turkey needs like international assistance. So far, like the UN and the EU and the United States and the other countries, Western countries, they have ramped up the support by sending the rescue operations and rescue teams to speed up the evacuation process to rescue operations in the affected cities. But still, like people lack like the facilities. Like there's a lack of shortage of tents, there's a shortage of food, there's a shortage of clean water. So the UN has recently warned about the WHO has warned about the diseases like diarrhea and other stuff due to like lack of sanitations in these provinces, especially the two major cities. Like I will talk about most importantly, that's Kahramanmaraş and Hatay, which are mostly affected, devastated by this powerful earthquake. Not even a single building is standing out there. The Turkish government has said like we will build 30,000 homes like that will start at the end of the February. But we know that the earthquake has affected many people. It's millions of people. So tens of thousands of people are homeless. So they are in desperate need. So the government is also like ramping up the support in order to. The government has announced like they will give support for rent and other stuff on a monthly basis to the affected families. But still, it's not enough. Like the international community must ramp up the support to help the people of Turkey. And the same case goes for Syria. In Syria, the same situation is going on. Like there's a huge trouble between government and the rebels, which are controlling some parts of Syria. The rebels are saying that we will not accept a single humanitarian aid from the government, Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. And 2 days ago, the UN chief Martin Griffiths said, the world has forgotten Syria. It has failed Syria. There is not enough support being given to Syria as they are giving to Turkey. So the international community must ramp up the support for Syria too, where 8.8 million people were affected by the powerful earthquake that struck on February 6th.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Syria, but you've given that much information. But we understand that rescuers are still pulling survivors from the rubble. Do you predict rescue operations, coming to an end anytime soon? It's been a week. How long can someone survive under the rubble of such a devastation?
Yeah, we see the news of the miracles every day from the Turkish media. The people are taking out alive from the rubble, but still there much needs to be done. The people are complaining about the lack of the much machineries and the lack of the rescue teams. And let me tell you, the devastation is so much huge. Still there are many places and many buildings which are collapsed, and the rescue teams haven't reached there just because of the huge rubble which is blocking the roads to reach those particular places. So the people are complaining they're waiting for their lovely ones, whether they're dead or alive, they're trapped under the rubble. So the Turkish government, the Turkish Disaster Management Agency, AFAD, they are doing everything in their capacity with the help of the international rescuers. But still, there is much needed to be done. And we know that, in Turkey, there's a much issue. The country is going to hold the fresh elections in June. So there is also a pressure from the opposition party, the Republican People's Party, which is called CHP or Jamhuri Halk Partisi here in Turkey. They are talking against the Erdogan for mismanaging the earthquake, the situation of the earthquake, and they're saying the government was not prepared for such a huge disaster. So what they were doing for last 20 years, so they're constantly blaming on the government, and the government is saying we have been prepared, but the devastation is so much huge that we cannot reach everywhere on time. But still, people are hoping many people will come out, and there's possibility the rescue operations will continue for months. The devastation is so huge, it's not a matter of weeks or days. It will take more than 3 months or 2 months until the rescue operations will complete, in order to wipe out the whole rubbles, to take out the people and the whole process. It will take months indeed.
Right. So give us some more perspective of this. Let me pick up from where you say people are complaining that the governments, of both countries, I believe, are not doing enough. Of course, there are international agencies, there are, people who are contributing to the rescue operations. And of course, the WHO's chief did say that there's risk of waterborne diseases and other issues concerning health that may come as a result of this earthquake. So, how much are the governments of both countries doing to ensure that the people that survived and the people that are rescued are getting the much needed care and the shelter and what have you that they need?
In case of Turkey, it's clear, the Turkish government, they have well-built institutions and they have experience of these kind of, handling these kind of natural disasters. But I'm telling you, more than 13 million people have been affected in Turkey by this earthquake. So the damage is so much huge. It's quarter of the population of the whole Turkey. The whole population of Turkey is 85 million. So out of 85 million, 13 million people have been affected directly or indirectly by the earthquake. So the homelessness is another problem. The freezing temperature is another problem. And the lack of, medicine, food, clean water, this another problem. So people are in dire situation. They're out of anger. They're talking against the government. The government is doing everything in its capacity. The only complaining, the only complaints that comes from these affected areas is that, why the Turkish government didn't send the army, in the first place. Well, let me tell you, I want to add this thing, the Turkish army reached to these rescue areas, to these affected areas after 3 days, in the third day. After the earthquake hit these areas. So people are complaining, if the army was sent initially, there might have been the possibility of saving more lives. But still, the devastation was so huge, the government was confused what to do and what not to do. And the international teams arrived in the second day, and this whole process started mostly after the third day of the since the earthquake hit these areas. So the situation is very dire, and WHO is right, the people are complaining about sanitation. People are forced to to go for sanitation in open areas. So there is no toilets. The toilets are needed. So Turkish government is doing its capacity, everything in its capacity to boost up support. So in case of Turkey, it's clear the rescue operations will continue for months, and the Turkish government will do its best to bring the situation under control as soon as possible. But about Syria, let me tell you, Syria is in much devastating position. So Syria is also facing sanctions, already sanctions from the collective West. So the collective West must lift those sanctions in order to boost up the humanitarian operations within Syria. Yesterday, the UN chief met with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad about opening the 2 checkpoints with Turkey in order to boost up the humanitarian operations. But there is still a problem, a political problem. That rebel control areas, they're not accepting a single aid or humanitarian assistance from the Syrian government. And the Syrian government is saying that without our approval, no one can open the checkpoints. So it's a big issue. And the Syrian government is asking the international community to lift the sanctions in order to boost up the humanitarian assistance in both countries. And let me tell you, the flash package, which announced by the UN, like $397 million or somewhat. These are just for this will just accommodate only 4.9 million population out of 8 million effectives in Syria. So just for 3 months. So what about after 3 months? Like what they will do? What about the rest of the 4 million people left? So the international community must do more. In case of Syria, Turkey somewhere Turkey has received much support from the Arab countries, from the European countries, from its friendly countries, but Syria is mostly neglected in this disaster. So Syria needs more support of international community.
Right. So UN authorities, have said that the focus of the aid efforts has shifted to helping, those without shelter or food, in this bitter cold. But how about those with shelters that have been impacted seriously, by the quake? They also need help too, because, you never know what will happen afterwards.
Yeah, the situation is very dire, as I told you earlier. The Turkish government is doing everything in its capacity. And we will not talk about Syria because the situation of Syria is very dire. Let me tell you, prior to the earthquake, the UN found that more than 15.3 million population in Syria are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. So Syria has been in need of humanitarian assistance from last 12 years, and due to sanctions, the humanitarian assistance were not reaching those areas. The people were highly affected, and the people are suffering. The children are suffering from malnutrition, and let me tell you, millions of children have been affected by this earthquake. So this is a dire problem. The situation is very dire in both Syria and Turkey. But in case of Turkey, I told you, they have well-built institutions, so they are trying their best to put every effort into its capacity, in order to boost up the rescue operations, in order to save more lives. And the operations are still going on, we have seen, in all provinces, which are affected by the earthquake. But still, we cannot ignore the warnings. We cannot ignore the future, what will happen, because the devastation is so much huge, it will take almost months, 3 months or 4 months, to handle this whole situation. So what about the people who have been affected? What about the homeless people who are forced to live in the streets by the earthquake? So this is a huge situation that need to be taken into consideration by the both governments and also by the international community. And plus about the reconstruction measure and the rebuilding measures will take even years. Let me tell you, 10 cities have been almost completely destroyed by the earthquake. So the rebuilding process will take almost years, to rebuild those cities and to repatriate those effectees, the homeless people, back to their homes. So it's a very dire situation, and the people are constantly complaining, the government is not doing enough. But the situation is very dire. There's much need to be done both by the government, by the people, by the civil society, and by the international community in order to boost up the support for the affected people.
Right, Shazad, we must thank you for coming on the program today and giving us more perspective on that disaster in Turkey and that has already affected Syria as well.
Thank you for having me.
We're coming up after the break. New Zealand looks to recovery after Cyclone Gabrielle. We'll have details of that in a moment, so do join us again. Let's get you all the stories elsewhere around the world. We begin in Scotland on this half. The country's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has announced her resignation after more than 8 years leading the Scottish government. In a press conference in Edinburgh, she said there was much intensity and brutality to the life of a politician than there was in previous years. She recently clashed with the Westminster government over gender reform laws and has faced pressure within the SNP over her tactics to deliver Scottish independence. However, Ms. Sturgeon insists her decision is not a reaction to recent issues, adding that she's been wrestling with the question of her future for weeks. She will remain leader until her successor is elected by the SNP, and she will stay as an MSP until at least the next Holyrood election in May 2026.
Today I am announcing my intention to step down as First Minister and leader of my party. I have asked the National Secretary of the SNP to begin the process of electing a new party leader, and I will remain in office until my successor is elected. Please know that while hard, and be in no doubt, this is really hard for me, my decision comes from a place of duty and of love. Tough love, perhaps, but love nevertheless for my party, and above all for the country. Let me set out as best as I can my reasons. First, though I know it will be tempting to see it as such, this decision is not a reaction to short-term pressures. Of course, there are difficult issues confronting the government just now, but when is that ever not the case? This decision comes from a deeper and longer-term assessment. I know it might seem sudden, but I have been wrestling with it, albeit with oscillating levels of intensity for some weeks.
Let's get more on this. Joining us on the programme is the former Minister of State for the UK and Europe and North America, Dennis McShane. He joins us now. Thank you so much for coming on to the programme today.
Thank you. And also someone born in Scotland with a lot of Scottish family, lived in the south, as you can probably hear from my voice, but a great affection for the country. And it's certainly been a remarkable history of a woman who joined her party at the age of 16 and has done nothing else. I mean, she is the queen bee in politics. I can't think of anybody who's been such a political animal. No family, a husband somewhere, no children. Here she is, 52, and all she's ever done is politics. And I have to say, I don't think her politics has been that successful. She has. I mean, she's been a first minister and a big personality, but Scotland is weaker and poorer than when she and her party took over. And her golden dream of secession, of separating from the rest of the country to which we all belong, doesn't seem to be catching fire. Wings aren't sprouting. So she retires without her dream fulfilled. And personally, as someone who doesn't like nationalism and doesn't like secession and separation and breaking up countries, we can all remember Nigeria's history, when I was a little boy. I'm glad that her quest to bust apart a functioning United Kingdom hasn't worked.
Right, so what does this mean for Scottish independence? Will Ms Sturgeon's preferred plan to use the next general election as a de facto referendum survive her departure?
I don't think so. Now, look, I'm going on reports. I'm not phoning up. I've got friends in the SNP, but I'm leaving them above all today to contemplate what they want to say about Mrs. Sturgeon. I mean, she is a remarkable machine politician. She's very fluent, very competent, very able, good communicator. But she did say the next election, likely next year, should be a referendum on Scottish independence. But people don't think that she's going to win extra seats. She got 45% of the votes in the last general election. That's in 2019 when Boris Johnson won. And the shine's gone off the Scottish Nationalist Party. There have been big scandals about poor problems in health, corruption involving big contracts for ferry boats, which are very important for Scotland with all its islands. Education, Scotland used to have much better education than England. It doesn't any longer. And a slightly odd handling of a problem to do with trans people. I can go into detail on it, but probably it's just too complicated. And so suddenly Mrs. Sturgeon has been seen to be losing her touch, and she may be getting out now before the voters deliver a verdict next year.
So the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has thanked her for her long-standing service, while Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer saluted her dedication and passion. What other impact is her departure likely to have on the UK-wide political scene this time?
Well, undoubtedly, as with her predecessor, a chap called Alex Salmond, suddenly Scottish nationalism threw up incredibly good television performers. I remember being on television on Question Time with Nicola 15 years ago. My goodness, she was as sharp as two buttons then. And of the people mentioned as possible successors, I mean, they're all good, solid professional politicians and dedicated and actually quite nice men and women, but none with her flair, let alone her predecessor's flair. And in a sense, this is a party that's been very much a cult of a personality, first of all, Alex Salmond, and then in the last 8 years, Nicola Sturgeon. Everybody defers to her. She takes all the decisions. Nothing happens without her say-so. And it's not clear if the SNP have got a third really top-class politician in the locker. We have at the moment in Rishi Sunak, a nice banker, spent a lot of time in America, becoming unbelievably rich. He's a pleasant man. He wants to do the best for the country, but he keeps getting things badly wrong. And it may be, again, in Scotland, there isn't a strong leader. And therefore, there's a chance for Keir Starmer. Interestingly enough, his name Keir is named after the founder of the Labour Party, a great Scottish socialist politician called Keir Hardie. So Keir Starmer may, this time next year, emerge as probably the most fluent and articulate of the major political figures in Britain, which, of course, will stand him in good stead in the election, plus the fact people are just tired now, fed up, bored with having all these conservative, not terribly impressive faces on the television.
So what sort of leader do you think Scotland needs at this time? You've paid glowing tribute to Nicola Sturgeon and what she represented, but now she's leaving. What kind of leader should Scotland have at this time?
Well, I would prefer both the English nationalists, that's to say the Tory party, who in the interest of the nationalist identity politics have effected a huge rupture with all our traditional partners and trading friends in Europe that have been trading with us for 1,000 years. And as a result, the British economy is much weaker. I'm not going to go into all the details, but almost every day now there's a new report on how negative Brexit is. That's a problem with nationalism, as with Scottish nationalism. The idea that if you break apart Nigeria or break apart Canada, you remember there were referendums in Quebec 30 or so years ago, and the Quebec nationalists said, let's break away from the rest of Canada. Let's all speak French, and Quebec will have a marvellous, wonderful future, like Boris Johnson says. Get rid of all the Europeans, and England will have a marvellous future. And Mrs. Sturgeon says, let's break with the rest of the United Kingdom, and we'll have a marvellous future. The plain fact is you don't. In the modern world, you either hang together or you're picked off one by one separately. So I hope the next leader makes a pitch for a Scottish government, which the Labour government, Tony Blair, gave them. I mean, it was the decision of the people who voted for that, and says, let's have a really good regional government like they have in Quebec, like they have in parts of Germany and Swiss cantons. We don't need, as I say, this obsession with tiny little penny packet states when we all ought to be cooperating together, both in the United Kingdom and, in my view, in Europe.
Right. Former Minister of State of the UK for Europe and North America, Dennis McShane, thank you so much for your perspective on the programme today.
Thank you.
And when we return on the programme, comfort dogs help Michigan State students cope after deadly mass shooting. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the programme. Rising seas pose unthinkable risks to billions around the world, with profound implications for security, international law, human rights, and the very fabric of societies. And that's according to United Nations officials. The comments were made as in Security Council members held their first ever debate on the phenomenon's global implications, noting that some nations' coastlines have already seen triple the average rate of sea level rise. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that in the coming decades, low-lying communities and entire countries could disappear forever. Describing sea level rise as a threat multiplier, the UN chief also said the phenomenon jeopardizes access to water, food, and healthcare.
Rising seas threaten lives and jeopardize access to water, food, and healthcare. Saltwater intrusion can decimate jobs and entire economies in key industries like agriculture, fisheries, and tourism. It can damage or destroy vital infrastructure including transportation systems, hospitals and schools, especially when combined with extreme weather events linked to the climate crisis. And rising seas threaten the very existence of some low-lying communities and even countries. Under any scenario, countries like Bangladesh, China, India, and the Netherlands are all at risk. Mega cities on every continent will face serious impacts, including Cairo, Lagos, Maputo, Bangkok, Dhaka, Jakarta, Mumbai, Shanghai, Copenhagen, London, Los Angeles, New York, Buenos Aires, and Santiago. The danger is especially acute for nearly 900 million people who live in coastal zones at low elevations, and that's 1 out of 10 people on Earth. The consequences of all of these are unthinkable. Low-lying communities and entire countries could disappear forever. We would witness a mass exodus of entire populations on a biblical scale. And we would see ever fiercer competition for fresh water, land, and other resources.
New Zealand officials say at least 4 people, including a child, have died in the devastation of Cyclone Gabrielle, which has caused significant flooding and landslides across the North Island. On Wednesday, officials confirmed a child's body was found in Hawke's Bay, one of the worst affected regions. While the rain has ceased in most parts, many remote towns and areas remain cut off by high floodwaters and lack of power. New Zealand's Prime Minister Chris Hipkins has called Gabrielle the biggest weather event to hit the country in the past century. Meteorological Service Weather Watch says Cyclone Gabrielle is now east of the country and continuing to track away from the North Island, with weather now improving.
What is clear is that the devastation is widespread, and it's taken a toll beyond property and livelihoods to people. There have been 4 confirmed fatalities as a result of the cyclone. The grief of their families and loved ones will be unimaginable. All those who were on roofs have been rescued. More than 9,000 people are expected to have been displaced across the region, with 3,000 in civil defence centres. Police report that 1,442 people are unaccounted for, mainly in the Hawke's Bay, as at 2:30 this afternoon.
Japan has told China that violations of its airspace by uncrewed surveillance balloons were absolutely unacceptable. Chief Cabinet Secretary Hirokazu Matsuno told reporters that after fresh analysis, unidentified objects that flew over its airspace in recent years are now strongly presumed to be spy balloons from China. He adds that Japan has strongly demanded China's government confirm the facts of the incident and that such a situation not occur again in the future. Japan's defense ministry had said the previous day that it strongly suspects Chinese surveillance balloons and had entered Japanese territory at least 3 times since 2019. Attention to past intrusions of Japan's airspace has heightened since the United States shot down a Chinese balloon this month and briefed officials from 40 nations about the object. US President Joe Biden has called for action to stop gun violence following the latest mass shooting at Michigan State University, where 3 were killed and 5 injured. Speaking at a keynote address to the National Association of Counties Legislative Conference in Washington, Mr. Biden said the shootings were a family's worst nightmare that's occurring far too often in the US. He vowed to do more to tackle gun violence. Monday's shooting came a day before the 5-year anniversary of the Valentine's Day massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, which left 17 students and teachers dead.
Our hearts are with the students and the families of Michigan State University. Last night I spoke with Governor Whitmer, and the FBI and additional federal law enforcement are on the ground assisting the state and local folks, and 3 lives have been lost and 5 seriously injured. And it's a family's worst nightmare. It's happening far too often in this country. While we gather more information, there's one thing we do know to be true. We have to do something to stop gun violence ripping apart our communities. Ripping apart. And today marks 5 years to the day that 14 students and 3 educators lost their lives in Parkland, Florida. I met every one of those families, spent time with them all. And a lot of you here have to confront violence in your communities every single day. We took a big step toward passing the most significant bipartisan gun legislation in 30 years, ghost guns and other things, background checks, but there's a lot more work to do. And I'm committing to getting it done with all of you. Some of you know that, and I'm going to say something that's always controversial, but there is no rationale for assault weapons and magazines that hold 50, 70 bullets.
And a day after a gunman killed 3 Michigan State University students and wounded 5 others before taking his own life, students on campus found themselves being comforted by a couple of cute, furry, 4-legged friends in order to cope with the tragedy. Boarders and others brought 4 golden retrievers to East Lansing, Michigan, as a resource for anyone impacted by the mass shooting. The gunman in Monday's shooting had a history of mental illness and carried a note in his pocket indicating a threat to 2 New Jersey schools. According to the police, 43-year-old Anthony Dwayne McRae, who lived in the adjacent city of Lansing, Michigan, the state capital, had no known affiliation to the university or associations to any of his victims. Well, that's it on the program today. Thank you for watching. I'm Joker Rogers.